I think it's pretty safe to say that everything we believe is grounded in certain presuppositions. There are certain visions of the way things are or the way things should be that determines what we believe or why we believe what we believe or how we justify our belief. And unfortunately, the basic presuppositions that lay the basis for what we believe aren't always brought out into the open or aren't always properly understood or even fully acknowledged. And this can sometimes cause issues in debates or in discussions, which is particularly problematic if you're discussing some important political or moral issue. Sometimes there are certain debates that happen which end up really bringing to light the core issues that are at stake. Because sometimes, over the course of certain debates, people will say things and they'll imply things which really bring to light their views on certain fundamental issues. And when we can discuss an issue on the level of our perspective on the most fundamental questions involved with the debates, then this really allows progress to be made on that issue. Now, back towards the end of last year, the leftist YouTuber and talk show host Sam Seder of The Majority Report published a video on The Majority Report's YouTube channel in which he and his co host discussed a recent court case in Ohio connected with the topic of abortion. And the reason why I want to talk about this video today is because in this video, he really brings to light certain of the fundamental issues at play in the topic of abortion. Now, you don't want to know how many times I've had debates or discussions with people on the topic of abortion, and they insist on framing the topic of abortion in a very specific way. There's a specific way in which they want to frame the issue that doesn't really get to the heart of what's at stake morally, legally, socially. And basically, whenever I've tried to connect their opinions with certain core, fundamental presuppositional issues in the abortion debates, they just refuse to take it there. They refuse to acknowledge that part of the reason why they and I have radically different views or come to radically different conclusions on the topic of abortion is because we're acting within two radically different frames of reference. And basically, unless we discuss that, and deal with that, there's never really going to be any progress on this topic. So, just for some context, and so let me share my screen here. The case that they're discussing concerns a woman named Brittany Watts, who is a woman from Ohio who had a miscarriage. And she had a miscarriage while using the bathroom, and she freaked out and she didn't know how to deal with the remains of the child, and so she flushed the fetal matter down the toilet. And apparently, she's being charged with the criminal defilement of a corpse, um, which is a considered, I believe, a misdemeanor in the state of Ohio. And as we shall see in the video, some people try to connect this law to another law, or they try to connect this case to a recent law in Ohio concerning abortion. That's sort of been a hotly debated issue among people of the state of Ohio for quite some time. Now, in this video, Sam Seder really brings to light, two issues that he views as fundamental to the debates on abortion. And the first is basically this notion that it's a women's rights violation, that any attempt to regulate abortion, by definition, infringes upon women's rights. But he also explicitly talks about the notion that the fetus that was born was not a person. And but he also brings up the issue that a fetus is not a person. And if the fetus is not a person, or if it's not even a living thing to begin with, then obviously it doesn't have the same rights and privileges as the mother. And therefore, your view on the nature of the unborn child lays the basis for everything else you view on the topic of abortion. Because if the fetus is, by definition, not a living thing, or if it is a living thing, but doesn't have it isn't a person, and therefore doesn't have the same rights and privileges as the mother, then by definition, any attempt to outlaw or um, over-regulate abortion is a violation of women's rights. Because obviously, the mother has more rights than, a piece of her fingernail that she bit off. She has more rights than a lock of hair that she cut off. Why wouldn't that be any different than, than with an unborn child? If the unborn child is not living, or if it is living but isn't a person. So those are really the two sets of presuppositions, your view on the nature of the unborn child and how you believe, because they are the only ones who can get pregnant, obviously. And so this is an issue that affects women in a special way. And so your views on the nature of the child and your views on the how abortion relates to women's rights more generally. But as we will explain over the course of the video, your views on the latter are dependent on your views on the former. But usually when you talk about abortion, it very often, especially for pro-choice people, very often the issue boils down to this, right? It boils down to denying that the unborn child is a person, or sometimes even a living thing, and therefore going on to say that because the unborn child, is not a person, you can therefore any attempts to regulate abortion count as a violation of women's rights. And again, I think Sam Seder represents a good attempt at bringing these fundamental issues to the fore. And basically, I would just say, even though I would strongly and even viscerally disagree with most, if not all, of what Sam Seder says here, I would have to say that all debates on abortion should attempt to focus on the sorts of issues that he brings up here, because these are really the issues on which any opinion, either for or against abortion, stands or falls. So, without further ado, let's get into it.
Let's talk about this. This is incredibly disturbing.
Yeah.
And but it gives you really, I think, an insight as to where we are going. For a long time, activists, others were arguing, myself included for that matter, that this notion about abortion is not about trying to save supposed babies. They're fetuses, incidentally, not babies. Not about trying to save babies.
And again, Sam, I would just say, what exactly is a fetus? Again, as we're gonna, unpack a little bit later, I think this distinction between, not all humans are persons, including as applied to the context of abortion, is just completely nonsensical, right? But let's continue.
It is trying to police, particularly women, all people who can give birth, to police sexuality.
Yep.
And so none of this stuff is to inhibit abortions per se. It does that, obviously, but it really is in furtherance of a broader enforcement of a specific sexuality that is defined ultimately by religious fundamentalism. And you hear the sort of the echoes of that in this case.
Now, the fact of the matter is, I think Sam Seder is making an overly broad statement here, right? I mean, obviously, it's hard to entirely divorce issues of abortion from issues concerning just sexual ethics more broadly, because obviously you wouldn't feel the need to get an abortion if you weren't pregnant, and you don't get pregnant outside of sex. Though, to be honest, I don't necessarily think you need to have the most conservative sexual ethic in order to take issue with abortion. Um, and as he will go on to say, he will go on to say, time and time again that a fetus, and he already kind of hinted at it here, that a fetus is not a person, that a fetus is not living. And therefore, abortion is an affront on women's rights. And basically, a pro lifer, such as myself, would basically challenge him on those 2 points. They would question whether or not regulating or outlawing abortion actually does, in fact, undermine women's rights. And they would question whether or not the fetus isn't a person or isn't living. And obviously, if you acknowledge that a fetus is a person, by definition, you can't be in favor of abortion. But hypothetically, I could see situations in which you could admit that the fetus is a person and yet still admit that it's okay to get an abortion. It would be like why it's okay to kill in self-defense. Serial killers are still technically persons, right? Soldiers fighting for an enemy military are technically persons. Someone threatening to kill you or your family, or a rapist, would technically still count as a person. And so there are instances in which it's still technically okay to kill a person. But even then, if you say that a fetus is a person, how you justify the notion that the mother's rights take precedence over the rights of the unborn baby requires a slightly more nuanced argument than if you were to say simply that the fetus isn't a person or that it's not living. And it's easier to build up the case that if the fetus is a person, that you don't have a right to take its life via abortion because it didn't do anything to deserve death. And any individual or entity who didn't do anything to deserve death, we would call a quote unquote innocent person. It's never okay. It's never, under any circumstances, to take the life of an innocent person. Um, because you're basically killing someone who didn't do anything to deserve being killed. And so, by definition, it's an unjustified murder. It's a morally unjustified murder. And so, you know, but like if you were to bring this up to Sam Seder, even he would admit it, right? Even he would say, yeah, if I were to go down that path of admitting the personhood of an unborn child, and if I were to admit that, an unborn child, that a fetus has equal rights to that of the mother, or to just people who are born in general, then I probably wouldn't be against abortion. For people who oppose abortion, for anti-abortion slash pro-life people, that's the issue that's at stake. Now, are there pro-lifers who want to regulate women and want to suppress women? Of course. But again, you don't need to necessarily have the most conservative views on sexuality or gender roles or gender relations, um, in order to take issue morally or legally with abortion. And and I would say that it's therefore not justified to say that most proponents of abortion support abortion, or rather, put it the other way around, that most opponents of abortion take issue with abortion because they want to suppress women. Most anti abortion people don't want to regulate women or suppress women or, put women down. That certainly, for example, is not what attracted me to the pro life movement. And I don't think that's what attracts most people to the pro life movement. But with that in mind, let's continue.
Um, there's a woman in Warren, Ohio, who had a miscarriage at 22 weeks while using the restroom. No idea what was happening. And the miscarriage fell into the toilet.
Yes.
And she attempted to flush the toilet, and the toilet backed up. And here is the report from WKBN News. This woman is on trial now with for felony abuse of a corpse. Here is some images from that trial in this news report.
Brittany Watts overcome with emotion after learning her case is moving forward. Watts is charged with felony abuse of a corpse, accused of trying to plunge a toilet after having a miscarriage delivery at 22 weeks while using the restroom.
She said she felt the baby come out and there was a big splash.
Investigators say they found a baby.
Just be clear, this is not a baby. This is a fetus. I don't know what definition you would need to constitute when a definitionally dead fetus, non-viable fetus, is not a baby. But continue.
So let me just comment on that right there. So again, here I think he explicitly states what's at the crux of the issue. And your views on this specific issue serve as the prism through which you view everything else. Like how you address or approach every other abortion or life related issue is based on this. Now, to say that a fetus isn't a baby is nonsensical. Again, that's the very definition of a fetus, is that a fetus is an unborn baby. I mean, that's part of what makes a fetus a fetus. But again, whether or not a fetus is a person, I mean, granted that at the time in which the trial took place, it was dead. But again, I think even here, there's a fundamental category difference between a dead person or former person or the remains of a person versus something that by its very nature is not a person. And I think he makes a fundamental category error here. Now, I would say that there is a legitimate pro-life critique of this case that can be made. Now, from what information I know about the case, Brittany Watts did not do anything to intentionally or knowingly, as far as I'm aware, to cause the fetus to become non-viable or to induce a miscarriage. So part of the reason why abortion is wrong, according to the pro-life view, the basic logic is that a fetus is a person. A fetus is more specifically an innocent person, a person who didn't do anything to deserve death. It's never okay to kill an innocent person, ergo, abortion is wrong. But there was no intentional taking of a life. Like a living being died, but there was no intentional taking of a life. And so this is not morally the equivalent of an abortion. And so I would say that this case is absurd, but not necessarily for the reasons that Sam Seder would say. But let's continue.
Weeks while using the restroom.
She said she felt the baby come out and there was a big splash.
Investigators say they found a baby stuck in a toilet at Watt's home on September 22nd. Forensic pathologist Dr. George Sturbins testified an autopsy found no injury to the fetus and that the unborn baby had died before passing through the birth canal. He says Watt's medical records showed she visited the hospital twice before the delivery.
This fetus was going to be non-viable. Okay. And it was going to be non-viable because she had premature rupture of membranes. Her water had broken early, and the fetus was too young to be delivered.
Both the assistant prosecutor and Watt's attorney argued why this case should or should not move forward.
The issue isn't how the child died, when the child died. It's the fact that the baby was put into a toilet large enough to clog up the toilet, left in that toilet, and she went on her day.
This 33-year-old girl with no criminal record is demonized for something that goes on every day.
Judge Terry Ivanchek found probable cause to bind the case over.
There are better scholars than I am to determine the exact legal status of this fetus, corpse, body, birthing tissue, whatever it is. Matter of fact, I'm assuming that's what most of these issue one's all about, at what point something becomes viable.
In Warren, Nadine Grimley, WKBN 27 First News.
Now, issue one, people remember, was the attempt or successful attempt by people in Ohio to vote for a referendum to provide a constitutional right to an abortion. But the idea that a woman could be brought to trial to face, or I should say a grand jury, to face charges that they have defaced a corpse of tissue that was never viable, ever, never achieved viability, ever. This is some county prosecutor starting to build the idea that as soon as conception occurs, that is a human being, that is a person. Because remember, like, non-persons are not subject to laws. And we have examples of that on some level, like, right? Like, I mean, people who are in Guantanamo Bay, they're considered basically non-entities within the United States. And certainly we have historically treated indigenous people in this country and slaves at various times as being basically non-entities. So there's no law. This is not a person. This is tissue that was never even viable.
So this is, I think, where the entire pro-choice argument revolves around. Because they'll say, well, it's a women's issue, but why is it a women's issue? It's a women's issue because by attempting to save the life of something that isn't a life, you're regulating you're infringing upon the rights of women. But basically, Sam Seder's argument here is that there is a distinction between persons and humans, right? And we have precedent of that throughout American history, with the way slaves were treated in Guantanamo Bay, with the way slaves were treated, with the way indigenous people were treated. Um, in basically Sam Seder's perspective is that it's misplaced there, but it's not misplaced when you're talking about a fetus. And why is that? Well, as he'll go on to say, it's because in order to be person, you have to be born, right? And because that's the thing. The fetus, the notion that the fetus is not living. I mean, I just think that that's nonsensical. It's made out of organic matter. It's, you know, it's it has its own unique genetic code. It, distinct from that of either parent, it grows, it's growing in such a way and at such a rate that within a matter of a few months, it's physically capable of surviving on its own, independent of the mother. And so the notion that a fetus is not living or that it's not a biological entity distinct from the mother or from the father is, I mean, that's just nonsensical. So I think it's clear that a fetus is a living thing, right? And, human parents don't give birth to children who are giraffes, right? So we're clearly talking about an unborn living organism of the human species. And human nature is such that we're the sorts of beings that you could identify as persons. And personhood is something that you can predicate onto human nature. Human nature, as such, includes personhood. Now, this isn't to deny that there could be non-human persons. And in fact, from the Catholic perspective, we would say that like angels or God would constitute non-human persons. And this is because part of what makes an entity a person is, having the capacity for free choice and rational thought. And of course, there's nothing that says that there can't be, like, that it's absolutely 100% either physically or metaphysically impossible for there to be intelligent life forms on other planets, and those would also constitute persons, right? By virtue of being intelligent beings. So I'm not going to get into the whole debate as to whether or not non-human entities could constitute persons. I personally am of the opinion that it's at least possible for there to be non-human persons. So I'm not saying that personhood is restricted or limited to humanness, but all humans, simply by virtue of having human nature, are persons, right? But the notion that you need to be born in order to be a person, the reason why I think that that's an unreasonable standard to have is because of this distinction between act and potency, right? Potency means having the ability or the possibility of something existing, or something existing in a particular way, or the capacity to do something, or to do something in a specific way. Act or actuality refers to the manifestation or realization of a potency. Now, when a thing doesn't exist, it exists in it exists in a state of pure potency. When a thing comes into existence, the potency associated with it has been actualized to some degree. Now, what separates a, you know, a fetus at the first moment of conception from a fetus at any other point in its prenatal development, from a child that's already born, and what separates, it's the same thing that separates a child who's already born from a 5-year-old, from a 10-year-old, from a 20-year-old, from a 50-year-old, from a 100-year-old. The potency associated with a specific human reality is actualized to various degrees, right? But from the very first moment of conception, you've been actualized. So that is to break it down from the very first moment of existence, an entity with human nature has made the transition from non-existence to existence. At the very first moment of conception, you exist as an entity with human nature. And the fact that a child who's born and a child who is, not born are at different phases of their development and therefore different phases of the actualization of their existence, that doesn't deny the fact that you have a nature. Like you are a being with a nature, and insofar as an entity with a nature exists at all, it doesn't matter to what extent the qualities or capacities of that nature have been fully manifested. Like, to put it in more simple terms, the only thing that separates a fetus from a baby who's born is what stage of development they're in. No one looks at a 5-year-old and says, well, because a 5-year-old is more developed than a newborn or a 1-year-old, you're more of a person, right? Like a 5-year-old has the physical capacity to walk. It has the cognitive and physical capacities necessary to talk, to communicate, you know, which a newborn or 1-year-old doesn't have. So simply by virtue of being human, by nature, the baby has the power, the capacity to exhibit certain qualities unique to humans or unique to persons, but their ability to actualize or realize that hasn't been brought about. There's some obstacle, namely their lack of proper physical development, that prevents that from being fully realized. And it's the same thing when you look at adolescents or adults. They have a capacity that a prepubescent child doesn't have, namely the capacity to reproduce. But teenagers and adults don't look at, children like prepubescent children and say, I can reproduce. You can't. Therefore, I am more of a person than you. So I don't see the reason why your level of development should determine whether or not you're considered a person. Because at any rate, you're still an entity that exists with a specific nature, and the nature that you have entails personhood. Now, again, that doesn't mean that there isn't a pro-life critique that could have been made of this case. Because the fact of the matter is, there was no intentional taking of human life. Like there was no intentional taking of a human life. And not only was there no intentional taking of a human life, but, when she flushed the fetal matter, the remains of the baby down the toilet, it was probably as a result of her freaking out. She probably wasn't expecting to miscarriage. She probably wasn't expecting to miscarriage, at least at that moment. It happened, as in the case of most miscarriages, randomly, spontaneously, unexpectedly, and she probably just freaked out. So, if there are any criminal charges, I don't think it should necessarily be tied to abortion, right? Because even the judge in this case connected it with Proposition 1. But basically, Proposition 1 was a law recently passed in Ohio that would allow for abortion up to a certain point, and then or rather, it was a law that sought to add to the Ohio state constitution the right to get an abortion up to a certain point, and then after that point, basically said that the state had the right to regulate or restrict abortion, but not in cases where the mother's health may be in danger. But basically, Proposition 1 enshrined into the Ohio Constitution the right to an abortion. But there is no connection here because again, I don't see any malice um on the part of Brittany Watts. And even if there is some legal basis on which to prosecute her, I don't see it as necessarily including, a violation of any anti-abortion laws, you know. And so again, I think there is a legitimate pro-life critique that could be made of this case, but it's not that, oh, it's because this represents an undermining of abortion rights. That's not the issue. The issue is that this doesn't technically constitute a violation of any pro-life or anti-abortion stance. But let's continue.
Yeah. Um, so I've known people who have had miscarriages, and it often occurs in the bathroom because you're not feeling well and something leaves your body. That's also often how at-home abortions via the abortion pill occur, where you're over the toilet, you're experiencing that kind of I mean, it depends on the person, but sometimes it's physical pain, and in the instance of a miscarriage, I mean, for many women, that's exactly what happens here. But beyond the physical pain, I'm just in awe of the complete callousness towards the emotional trauma of, first of all, having a miscarriage, then having the details of that miscarriage being litigated in a potential criminal proceeding because she didn't inspect the bloody fetal tissue that had just left her body in a way that was likely traumatic and scary, because miscarriages are very, you don't exactly know what's happening.
And I would actually agree with that point in the sense that there has to have been a better way to address this issue, right? Like, very often having a miscarriage, especially when it's, unexpected or happens randomly or happens because of issues beyond your control, is traumatic. And there has to have been a way to deal with this issue that didn't compound the emotional issues. That doesn't necessarily saying that this case is absurd or that there's a better way or that there should have been a better way of dealing with it is, in my opinion, that doesn't lead necessarily to saying that abortion is okay. But let's continue.
Because she didn't inspect it before flushing it down the toilet, which is, it's a blood mass, and it makes sense to flush it down the toilet. And even the cop there who was testifying kept calling it a baby over and over again.
Because it is or was a baby. But details.
despite the fact that the testimony clearly says
From the forensic pathologist.
that the fetus was non-viable and was dead upon evacuation. And
I would say that obviously the child was dead, right? I mean, it was DOA. But I feel that with anyone who is pro-choice or sympathetic towards the pro-choice perspective, it's not just a matter of the child was dead. And so you could hypothetically say that human remains or a dead person are morally, legally, ontologically in a different category than a living person. But again, I don't think, based on the sorts of conclusions that pro-choicers are coming to, and based on the sorts of rhetoric that's often used, that isn't the context of their conclusions. That's part of it, but I think it's also, if she had chosen to get an abortion, they would have still said, so what? You have no right to regulate it or outlaw it. So they don't necessarily see fetuses as persons to begin with, you know. And again, a being that is or has the potential to live and then dies is ontologically distinct from an entity that, never existed in the first place. An entity that, is a person or could potentially become a person or could potentially be a person is distinct from a non-person, So
Black women in this country have higher mortality rates when it comes to childbirth, but also they have increased risk of miscarriages compared when you look at white women in comparison as well. And so,
which is an issue in this country. I mean, poor people and ethnic minorities don't always have, because of various historical and socioeconomic issues, don't always have access to the best healthcare. That is an issue. But I would say that there are alternatives to abortion, right? I would say that, if you do things like increase access to, quality healthcare, if you try to, if you spend more money on, trying to deal with and lessen or even eliminate the instances where abortion or like the issues connected with like sort of pregnancy related complications, then if you did more of that, you would end up lessening the perceived need for abortion. Now, concerning the Brittany Watts case, I mean, because of their lack of access to quality health care, ethnic minorities, especially African Americans, and and poor people are more likely to have a miscarriage. But the fact of the matter is, while I would agree that in cases like the Brittany Watts case in specific, you need to be sensitive to these sort of broader socioeconomic issues and act in accordance with that, I would agree with that. But I don't think that that proves the point that Sam Seder is trying to prove, because he says the fact that people don't care about that, the fact that a woman is going to get arrested for doing absolutely nothing wrong is a sign that, like, this is what the pro-life movement wanted. They want to create a society where if the slightest thing happens to a woman, if the slightest thing goes wrong during or in connection to pregnancy, then you can end up getting you know, arrested or fined or something. And again, I think there's good reasons to believe that that shouldn't be the case. That like you shouldn't have these nonsense, cases like this that people need. Like there are certain moral distinctions that you can make even as a pro-life proponent that would lead you to believe that this case is morally absurd, legally absurd. And so I don't think that cases like this are the inevitable legal result of, of abortion or of outlawing abortion. You know, regulating women while regulating women is not the end goal legally or morally or socially of the pro-life case. You know, um, continuing to tighten the screws for, you know, poor women or minority women is not, the end goal legally, morally, politically. But, let's continue.
When we get into the different layers of how these kinds of anti-woman, anti-choice laws are going to be deployed, it's going to be in a racist manner by definition, just because of those figures and because of the systemic racism in our country and the health and that also exists in the healthcare system as well. And like, it strikes me too that we've talked about this before. Conservatives and right-wing religious folks often see when a woman miscarries or a person who can get pregnant miscarries that they must have done something wrong, that they're not like the perfect earthen vessel for the fetus. And well, I mean, a black woman probably did a little bit more wrong than a white woman, right? And so this is like, in part, the state using their disciplinary power to enforce God's natural law.
Again, that's very much of a straw man. Because, I mean, in the end of the day, this notion that every bad thing that happens to you is necessarily a punishment from God, it is not the official historical Christian stance, right? I mean, even in the Bible, you know, there's this notion that, sometimes God permits evil as a punishment for sin. But again, that's even the Bible itself goes on to nuance this claim, right? And I think the issue that Emma here is dealing with is speaks more to the various cultural or sociological issues that influence or determine how religion is interpreted and implemented. And the broader question of, are you interpreting a religion in a manner consistent with its foundational principles, as opposed to, are you interpreting a religion in a way that simply validates some agenda, in this case, to put down women and minorities? And the thing is, you could ask that question, when there are some religious people, I would not include myself in that category, but there are some religious people who would not be sympathetic towards women who have miscarriages and say, you must have done something wrong. Again, speaking from the perspective of a religious person, I do think that instances in which women have miscarriages, they do need to be treated with a sense of respect, with a sense of sensitivity, with a sense of kindness, with a sense of understanding. And I don't think we should treat the issue in a way that compounds the issue, you know? And like that's the thing. Like I know lawyers who try to take a more, and again, they don't, not necessarily lawyers who deal with issues of like, you know, like they don't necessarily deal with abortion issues, but just as a general professional policy, they try to deal with every single employee, no, and every single client, especially the clients, with a sense of respect and understanding, right? And I think, when even the judge and the lawyers involved in this case need to, approach this case understanding the emotional sensitivity of what's going on, right? And not that we need to be overly politically correct or walking on eggshells, but don't do things that will compound the issue, right? And I think you can acknowledge that fact while also being against abortion. You know, you can be pro-life and also say this case isn't necessarily directly related to the pro-life movement, and shouldn't be necessarily lumped in with that. So,
Would also argue, and this is just my own speculation, but I wouldn't be surprised if this wasn't one of those situations too, where there's, some type of Ohio organization or a national organization that is looking for these type of cases again, particularly in the Ohio in the wake of the amendment that basically enshrines abortion and contraception and miscarriage care into the Ohio Constitution. If this isn't some type of like last ditch effort to derail that, because to give the opportunity at least for the Ohio judiciary to claim that this is a person. I mean, if they can get to personhood, and this is why they call it personhood, right? This is why they have to pass laws, because a non-born human life is not a person.
So here he admits that it's a life. But what makes a non-born life not a person? I mean, if it's because of lack of consciousness, then you could say it's okay to kill someone who's in a coma. You could say it's okay to kill someone when they're asleep. If it's because of lack of development, well, you're not fully developed until you're an adult, right? And so why can't, adults look at anyone under the age of 18 or anyone prior to reaching full biological maturity and saying, you're not a human because you're not fully developed? Why can't teenagers and adults look at children and say, you don't have the ability to reproduce, you're not a person? Why can't children look at babies and say, you don't know how to walk and talk? You're not a person. So just because you're not fully developed doesn't mean you're not a person. You're still an entity that exists that has human nature. And simply by virtue of having human nature, and simply by virtue of the fact that human nature necessarily entails, personhood, which is why I would agree with Sam Seder that slavery is wrong, that torture is wrong, that the way in which America in recent years has been, dealing with, prisoners of war or suspected terrorists was wrong. The way we treated indigenous people was wrong. But simply by virtue of being a creature with free will, simply by virtue of being a creature with human nature, you are a person.
That's just the bottom line. You don't hear the Constitution talk about human beings. You hear them talk about citizens. You hear them talk about persons and people. And they don't refer, Constitution doesn't refer to life.
And again, all I can say to that is, so what? I mean, first of all, how do you know he's not reading back into the text, like a pro-abortion stance, right? Like, how do you know that pro-life, that the founding fathers necessarily interpreted the this, when they talked about citizens and persons rather than simple human beings or living organisms, that how do you know that they necessarily meant that in a way that was inclusive of, not having a problem with abortion? But again, even if they did, no one's saying that the Constitution is an infallible text, right? So you would also have to explain why that distinction, whether it's coming from the mouth of Sam Seder or Thomas Jefferson, why is that morally justifiable? Why is it morally justifiable to say that not every human life is a person? Because obviously they got it wrong when they were talking about slaves and Native Americans. Why is that correct or good when it applies to non-born entities, humans? So,
And this is because you're not a person with rights until you are born. Now, we have criminal statutes about the status of people as pregnant as increasing penalties. In the same way we have hate laws on some level, we talk about contextual relationships with the rest of society. But that is a function. That is a function of the status of the person who's alive.
so first of all, he said it's a status of the person who's alive, as if the mother is alive and the preborn or unborn child isn't, which seems to contradict something that he said earlier, where he at least implied that he believed that he saw a non an unborn person as being a life, which you can be a living thing and not a person, or if you're not living at all, you cannot be a person. Those are the only two ways in which you can be a non-person. Either you're a non-living thing or you're a living thing that doesn't qualify as a person. But which is it? Second of all, I would have to ask, what is it about the status of the pregnant woman in relation to the rest of society that, gives her that status, that special status, so that the social and legal implications of killing a pregnant woman are somehow worse or carry a much stronger moral weight than killing a non-pregnant woman. Like, what is it about the the what's inside of her uterus, embryo, womb? What is it about the thing that's inside there that gives the pregnant woman that extra status in relation to the rest of society? And I think this ultimately brings up a good point that, goes back to something that was mentioned by Christopher Hitchens. And Sam Seder kind of maybe goes a little bit in that direction. I don't know how far he would push this, but the notion that a um, Christopher Hitchens said, and far be it for me to really agree with Christopher Hitchens on anything, but he brought up a point where he said that the fetus is a potential or future person. It's therefore a potential or future member of the community, which I would say it already is a person, and therefore already in some sense or to some degree a member of the community. But I mean, that question aside, those are the only two options. It either is already a person or it's a potential person, and therefore a potential or future member of the local community, and abortion carries with it just as many social implications, and is just as much of a social issue, just as much of an issue that society has a stake in as the individual mother. So to say that it's purely a private decision and that, it's not something that has impacts on the larger community, and that the larger community doesn't have a stake in saying something about, is, you know, that's obviously not a right-headed way of approaching the issue, But again, I think it also goes back to this very American mindset of don't violate my rights, right? Um, and I think here, this notion that it's like, because again, Sam Seder kind of seems to indicate that even being pregnant or carrying a child carries with it a larger set of social implications, right? And but the thing is, this notion of like that it's just purely me, it's just between me and my doctor, and no one else needs to have any say or bearing on it. Again, people who the minute you begin to say that sort of rhetoric, you come off sounding like the Second Amendment gun rights people, where it's like any attempt to regulate guns is automatically taken as, a violation of your constitutional rights. But not every way of using a gun is moral or legal. So within certain limits, placing regulations on guns is not a violation of First Amendment rights, or Second Amendment rights, rather. And I think it ultimately comes down to this, where if the fetus is just a clump of cells and therefore just an extension of the mother's body, then it is just between you and the doctor. If the fetus is actually a living thing and a person, then a woman still does have bodily autonomy. But you don't have the rights to make use of the right to bodily autonomy in a way that violates the rights and dignity of another person. Just like everybody has Second Amendment rights, we don't have the right to make use of those rights in a way that hurts other people. And so, I mean, and even just the broader social implications of abortion and pregnancy, I think, militate against this sort of ultra-libertarian sort of view on the issue. But I would say that, whether or not this is a violation of the women's rights depends on the status of the child. Which is why, again, I think there are really two suppositional issues for the question of abortion. Firstly, how does it relate to women's rights? Secondly, what is the status of the child? And your view on the first set of suppositions is dependent on your view on the second. Because no one goes to jail for throwing away, toenail clippings, right? But the minute you start talking about fetus, it gets a little bit different. Because even just, from a purely scientific perspective, it's a distinct biological entity from the mother. And so even then you're getting into some terrain where it's, not just an extension of the mother's body, but I could see why you would want to construe it as that morally, legally, philosophically, if it's not a person. So, but let's continue.
I don't know how you have a corpse when you never had a live person.
Also, what was that woman supposed to do? Call the cops, I guess, after she had a miscarriage, because just to say, "Hey,"
I'm curious as to how the authorities were alerted to this.
Well, But just to say, hey, cops, I just went through a really traumatic moment where I lost a baby that was growing inside of me.
I'd like a cop here, please.
I would please, you know, I don't know what her personal feelings are. I would never want to speculate, but there are, of course, complicated feelings, to put it mildly, that many Black people have about calling the police. And I will say that any human being in this country would have a complicated feeling outside of the racist implications of it about calling the police when they have a traumatic and personal health episode and saying like, hey, can you come and intervene here, cops? Let alone the fact that there is a chilling atmosphere right now when it comes to abortion. And many women would probably feel, because they see prosecutions around the country of women, that they could be framed and put into a situation where they would be in trouble with the law. And it didn't matter in this instance. But like, this is what happens when we've decided that this is no longer a right. A right is decreed and by the federal government, not on a state by state basis. So,
but I would say, again, this leads to some debate on the nature of the pro-life movement. You know, in my understanding of how the pro-life movement is to be implemented, obviously, we should look back at cases like this and, you know, we need to make those sorts of moral distinctions and be like, okay, well, obviously with Brittany Watts, she had a miscarriage. Having a miscarriage, especially when it's not the result of anything you did to bring it about, is not morally on the same level as getting an abortion. And so, you know, especially now that Roe v. Wade, you know, has been overturned, hopefully we do start to see more consistent progress in the building up of a society that respects life. But again, in doing so, I think we need to just use our heads. And I think proponents of the pro-life movement who would not see an issue with this are not making the necessary moral distinctions to see why a woman who had a miscarriage freaked out and flushed the remains down the toilet, why that is not morally or legally the same as intentionally taking the life of the baby. You know? But again, you know, I think Sam Seder and his co-hosts here believe that, again, they believe that legalizing abortion inevitably leads to this sort of stuff. It inevitably leads to the overregulation on the part of the government towards female sexuality. It inevitably leads to the further disenfranchisement of poor people and ethnic minorities. You know, and again, I think that's not something necessarily entailed in being pro-life, right? Because we just need to use our heads, right? I mean, we're outlawing a specific type of medical procedure as being immoral. We shouldn't be doing things to make access to healthcare for pregnancy-related issues, just like in general. We shouldn't be trying to make that more difficult. We shouldn't be prosecuting women for any time anything goes wrong, you know, in a pregnancy, especially if it wasn't the direct result of anything that she did. You know? But let's continue.
so we do not have a right to an abortion in this country. This is
Well, just inherently, nobody has a right to an abortion. Not just in the sense that that right was taken away in the Dobbs decision, but just morally, you know, insofar as abortion is an unjustified killing, you don't inherently have that right. But let's continue.
what happens when you leave when you leave it up to the states and remove that as a right, because we get the criminal justice system involved, and it's enforcing criminality onto women that don't meet the standard of being perfect growers of, the man's seed or whatever.
Well, I mean, that's not the issue. The issue is not whether or not a woman is a quote unquote perfect vessel for the growing of the man's seed. That's not the issue. The issue with abortion is that you're taking an innocent life. And the issue with this case is that, this is not morally the equivalent of abortion, and people in Ohio are treating it as if it is. And the problem is that we need to, again, just people need to use their heads, and I think people think in overly broad terms, just with the abortion issue in general, including on the pro-life side, but the solution to absurd cases like this is not to make abortion legal. The solution to cases like this is don't be an idiot. Don't, don't take this overly broad definition of what constitutes abortion and, go after a woman anytime anything bad happens in the context of pregnancy, right? But again, I can make that fundamental distinction as a pro-lifer, right? Because my aim here is not to attack women. My aim here is to go against abortion. And when that is the attitude or the agenda that you have, then you don't fall into making mistakes like this. But let's continue.
So it's about punishing women, and it's about making sure that they're under the thumb of the patriarchy as enforced by the state as well. That's a depressing story.
Yep. Really distressing, depressing, and also really disturbing.
We're sure it's not a hoax, though? Maybe
Right.
It's been a political hoax or something like that.
Well, right. That was what Tim Pool said about the 10-year-old who had to leave the state of Ohio to get an abortion. Not that the story was a hoax, but the fact that it was
that people-
politicized
Yes.
was a hoax, which makes zero sense. But more and more of these stories are going to keep coming out.
So, I mean, in the end of the day, the issue here is that, first of all, like again, they ended on the note of this is state-sponsored or state-enforced patriarchy. And the reason why they can say that is because they can say that a fetus is not a person. And because a fetus is not a person, any attempt to regulate or outlaw abortion is a violation of women's rights by default. And so the thing is, those are the issues that are at stake in the abortion debate. Is it a violation of women's rights? And is it, the taking of an innocent human life? And that's ultimately what's at play just in the abortion issue in general. And where you fall on those questions determines your reaction to everything else. And so my suggestion is we need to keep a clear focus, right? I mean, obviously not every abortion-related issue is going to explicitly go back to this. But again, that's what's at stake here. Are you taking an innocent life? And then, if the fetus, how do the rights and privileges of the fetus relates to those of the mother? That's ultimately the foundational issue here. And so I would just recommend going forward, what we need to do is realize that, in order for us to actually convince other people of the pro-life position, we need to show people how their response to any abortion-related issue ultimately goes back to how they respond to these questions, and to get people to think through the implications of these questions and how they relate to any specific pro-life issue that happens to be, going on, that they happen to be responding to. And if we do that, we will be able to create more philosophically robust, visions of the abortion debate, of the issue of abortion, and be able to actually make progress. If we can actually get people to acknowledge that the issues concerning abortion are what they are, and get people to actually think through it in a, like what I was doing here. Sam Seder in this video explicitly said the foundational issues that were at stake in the abortion debate, and I responded to it. And we need to realize that any rational debate is an attempt to sort of systematically move forward from these first principles. And we need to ultimately make people aware of what the first principles are on either side of the debate. In order to win people over to the pro-life position, we need to ultimately show them why the ethical and ideological starting point of abortion, of the anti-abortion debate, of the anti-abortion side, is more robust and um more viable, and why accepting abortion isn't going to lead to this complete overturning of women's rights and state enforced patriarchy. We need to essentially show people what's at stake and why the pro-life position is the best alternative in these debates. So with that in mind, thank you very much and God bless.